Welcome to National Parks Traveler, where we explore the national parks and the issues that involve them.
There are more than 2,000 species currently listed as threatened or endangered under the Endangered Species Act. And while species that gain protection under the Act have a great chance to survive, not all do. This is Kurt Repenchek, your host at the National Parks Traveler. Just recently, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service announced that 21 species, birds, fish, mussels, plants, even a bat, were officially declared extinct. We're going to discuss that news and the role of the Endangered Species Act in striving to prevent extinction with Noah Greenwald, the Endangered Species Director at the Center for Biological Diversity, and Lindsay Rosa, the Vice President of Conservation Research and Innovation at Defenders of Wildlife. We'll be back in a minute with Noah and Lindsay.
The Everglades Foundation, the only organization whose sole mission is to restore and protect America's Everglades. Learn more at evergladesfoundation.org. The Yosemite Conservancy helps visitors connect with Yosemite through adventures, volunteering, and the arts. It's the only nonprofit dedicated to supporting Yosemite National Park and funds grants to improve trails, restore habitat, protect wildlife, and inspire the next generation of nature lovers. Learn more at yosemite.org. Treat your finances to a 3-month certificate at Interior Federal Credit Union. This is a limited time opportunity to receive 5.22% annual percentage yield on a 3-month certificate. Available beginning October 2nd, 2023 for new money only. Available for members of Interior FCU. Need to join? Apply at interiorfcu.org. Federally insured by NCUA.
Welcome back to the Traveler, guys.
Thank you.
Hey, Kurt.
So, as I mentioned in an introduction, there are more than 2,000 species listed under the Endangered Species Act as either threatened or endangered, and ranging from the red wolf with a population of barely more than a dozen in the wild, to the lesser-known American burying beetle. Not too many people know about that, and with that great number of species under the Act, we just had word from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that 21 species have officially been declared extinct. Is that surprising?
It's not surprising in the sense that most of these species hadn't been seen for decades. And in fact, most of them were probably extinct before the Endangered Species Act was even passed. So it really never had a chance to save them. Because again, they were already extinct. And it just, because you have to prove a negative, it really takes a long time to make that final call and say something is extinct.
With the Fish and Wildlife Service officially declaring extinct some species that haven't been seen in decades, as you mentioned, Noah, Bachman's warbler and the little Marina fruit bat, just for two of them. Lindsay, you've said that many of these species were added to the Endangered Species Act when they were too far gone to truly benefit from saving. Can we get ahead of the extinction curve?
Yeah, that's right, Kurt. I think, the big thing here is, and this is a common theme that we see with listed species in the Endangered Species Act, it was too little, too late, right? A lot of these species we hadn't seen for quite a while, and were likely extinct by the time that they actually were listed and were afforded some of the protections under the Act. Even for those, that were still cited after listing, funding resources weren't really there to help move them closer to recovery. And that's something that's not really new. This is kind of a theme, if you're wait till there's few or no individuals left in the population, it really makes it hard to bring them back from the brink, which is really the intent of the Endangered Species Act, right? As Congress intended, that's its goal, to prevent extinction and recover species to the point where they no longer need the protections of the Act. So really, this was not a failure of the Endangered Species Act at all. This is waiting too long to get those species who need the protections most, the protections, and not getting them the resources and oftentimes the funds to recover them.
Well, I'm wondering, are we on kind of a treadmill or a loop in that a lot of times we're discovering species and it's too late? And we're constantly discovering new species around the world. So I'm just wondering, how many more species will we discover, so to speak, and it's too late to save them under the Endangered Species Act?
That's a good question, given that we don't even know how many species are out there, right? Yeah, we'll continue to be discovering them. And I think to the point, there are those who we have rediscovered and have made great strides toward recovery. I think one of the great poster children for that is the black-footed ferret, right? Thought to be extinct until a rancher's dog found one, and brought it home. And then, that really gave agencies, services, the communities a chance to act, to really make a difference, and ensure that implementation of the act, conservation efforts across different stakeholders, and of course, captive breeding efforts could help start to move that species toward recovery and away from extinction. And we're seeing, right, growing populations, and it's certainly not a full success story just yet, but it's one of those where, yeah, we thought it was extinct, we thought it was gone, but it's still here with us today. And that is one of the beauties of the Endangered Species Act, is it's still our strongest, most successful tool for stemming extinctions and biodiversity loss. And again, its success is certainly, I think, demonstrated by the number of species that are still with us here today because they've been listed under the Act.
Noah, I'm curious. One of the species that everybody thought was extinct and now Fish and Wildlife is saying, well, we're not exactly sure, is the ivory-billed woodpecker. I mean, that seems to be the holy grail of species and whether it's extinct or not extinct. Were you surprised that they decided not to list it as officially extinct?
I think they got a lot of blowback from calling it extinct. And I would love to believe that it still survives. That would be great. There's not strong evidence to support that at this point. There's been some photos that have been taken, but they don't really have the detail that's needed. It closely resembles pileated woodpeckers, which are a common bird. And so you would need a high quality photo or video in order to show that it wasn't extinct. And that hasn't happened. That hasn't been produced. And so I really appreciate the people who they wanted to survive. And I get that. I get that desire to believe that this thing isn't gone. But it sure seems like it is.
Yeah. There have been books written about searching for it and not finding it, and books written about people who think they've seen it.
One thing I will mention about that species is, there is video of the species from the 1940s, which, I encourage your listeners to Google and watch. It's really quite heartbreaking to see that. And then one thing about it, I think, really highlights the importance of the Endangered Species Act, because those birds were videoed in this place called the Singer Tract in Louisiana, and it was owned by the Chicago Mill and Paper Company. There were appeals for them not to log it that were ignored. They essentially made a decision to drive a species to extinction for short-term profits, and because there was no Endangered Species Act, there was no way to stop that from happening.
Now, 9 of the 21 species recently declared extinct were freshwater mussel species. Why are freshwater mollusks the most endangered species in the United States?
Well, actually, freshwater extinction, there's studies showing that freshwater species in North America are going extinct roughly 10 times what terrestrial species are going extinct at. And, it's just a combination of factors that are leading to that: dams, pollution, changes in stormwater runoff, invasive species. So there's just a host of threats to our freshwater ecosystems, and we just don't treat rivers the way that we should. Really discouraging to see the Supreme Court, determine that, the Clean Water Act doesn't protect roughly half the wetlands and non-perennial streams in the U.S. Instead of strengthening the Clean Water Act, which is what we need to do, we need to deal with non-point source pollution. They substantially weakened its oversight at exactly the wrong time to be doing that.
Yeah, that was a real shocker. Lindsay, is there another big factor that leads to extinction in the United States?
Yeah, I mean that's a lot of, we have the 5 basically main human-induced drivers of biodiversity loss, right? Which has kind of been identified globally. So Noah certainly mentioned a number of them, and certainly for freshwater mussels and other aquatics, those are some major ones, right? Land and sea use change, pollution, invasive species. The other 2, obviously, being overexploitation and climate change. So I think that's, those were things that were identified globally, but certainly things that are also playing a role here in the US, and certainly with our threatened and endangered species as well.
This is Kurt Repenchek with National Parks Traveler. We're talking today about Extinction and the Endangered Species Act with Noah Greenwald, the Endangered Species Director at Center for Biological Diversity, and Lindsay Rosa, the Vice President of Conservation Research and Innovation at Defenders of Wildlife. We're going to take a short break. We'll be right back.
Listener and reader support make the National Parks Traveler possible every day of the year. If you enjoy the Traveler's content, please consider a donation at nationalparkstraveler.org. Acadia National Park is one of the 10 most popular national parks in the United States. It's also one of the smallest and most vulnerable. That's why Friends of Acadia exists. Friends of Acadia is an independent organization of passionate people inspiring those who love this magnificent park to make a real and lasting difference for Acadia. You can make a difference at friendsofacadia.org. Whether it be strategy, business planning, change management, board development, executive search, or diversity planning, Potrero Group is here to help. They mix a depth of experience in the parks and land space with a breadth of best practices from other industries. For more information or to schedule a preliminary conversation, go to potrerogroup.com, Potrero group.com. Washington State is graced with 3 spectacular national parks, each different and special in their own unique ways. As the official nonprofit partner and the only philanthropic organization dedicated exclusively to supporting these parks through charitable contributions, Washington's National Park Fund has a mission to raise private support to deepen everyone's love for, understanding of, and experiences in Mount Rainier, North Cascades, and Olympic National Parks. Share your passion for these parks at WNPF.org.
So, in talking about what is driving species to extinction, I guess we also have to include politics, right? I mean, the Trump administration rewrote the definition for critical habitat for species and allowed agencies to consider economic impacts when designated critical habitat. I mean, if those definitions had been allowed to stand and were not, reversed by the Biden administration, that could have gone a long way to impacting critical habitat for these species, no?
Well, actually, Kurt, the Biden administration didn't fix the problem with critical habitat, unfortunately. It's still in place. They didn't touch that at all. So it's for a species, for an action to be considered to adversely modify critical habitat, which is technically prohibited for federal agencies, they would have to affect the whole of a critical habitat designation. So for a species like the northern spotted owl that has 9 million acres of critical habitat, there's essentially no clear cut that would be big enough to impact the whole of that critical habitat. And so it essentially makes critical habitat meaningless for for widely distributed but quite imperiled species like the northern spotted owl or the Gulf sturgeon or any number of species.
What's the Biden administration's answer for not changing that?
There really hasn't been one. They really haven't said a thing about it, and it's been a disappointment under the Biden administration. Fish and Wildlife Service is an agency that's really badly in need of new leadership and reform, and we just haven't seen that at Fish and Wildlife Service under this administration. We've seen some of that at the EPA, and we just have not seen that with Fish and Wildlife Service. It's been very disappointing.
Yeah. So clarify that for me. Did they let both of those definitions stand, those changes in the definition stand, or did they reverse one of them?
They did get rid of the economic considerations in listing, which wouldn't have stood up in court anyway. I mean, it's clearly contrary to what the statute says, but they did get rid of that part.
I'll throw this out to either one of you. I'm not exactly sure what the answer is, but the Florida panther, one of the most critically endangered mammals in the country, has never had critical habitat designated by Fish and Wildlife, to the best of my knowledge. Any idea what the holdup is there? Is it necessary? Is it not necessary?
I mean, it would be great if they had critical habitat. We actually were part of an effort to petition to have Fish and Wildlife Service designate critical habitat. They declined to do so. Roughly, only 40% or so of listed species have critical habitat. And, it's again, something that the Fish and Wildlife Service has just ran away from almost from the beginning.
Oh, yeah, I would say, that's right. Not all species have critical habitat designated. And even those that do, some of that was, again, pretty delayed. So, a lot of it comes down to resources, staff, money, all of these things to be able to list a species, to recover a species, to come up with a plan. Every single piece of this puzzle that helps to keep species from the brink of extinction and with us, all of it, we need money and resources to make it happen. And the Endangered Species Act and the services kind of charged with implementation are pretty much starved for funding when it comes to that. So we did an analysis to find that essentially the Fish and Wildlife Service is getting less than half of what it needs in terms of full funding to implement the Endangered Species Act as it was intended. So it's hard, and the impact at the end of the day is not being able to get the species the full protections that they deserve.
In the case of the panther, is it also the checkerboard land makeup? I mean, there's a lot of private property, and I'm guessing the Fish and Wildlife Service probably doesn't want to turn private property into critical habitat.
Well, I mean, a couple of things there. One is that, critical habitat doesn't have a big impact on private property. It doesn't create restrictions for private landowners unless they need some sort of federal permit. So in a lot of cases, it wouldn't. It doesn't create a preserve. I would note, too, that, Lindsay's absolutely right. There's not enough money being put towards endangered species at all, given how serious the problem is. I mean, Fish and Wildlife Service's recovery budget is, roughly $75 million, which in, U.S. government terms is really just pennies, not even pennies, really. But I would say, that that's not the whole of it. There's been a reticence on the part of the agency to do its job. And I guess I would say, that's exemplified with critical habitat by the fact that, for throughout the 80s into the early 90s, they routinely did not designate critical habitat. They always concluded that it was not prudent until they were taken to court, and the courts found that the exception had swallowed the rule. So they there's with the panther, I would say, and you hit the nail on the head at the beginning, Kurt, when you said it's politics, because that's absolutely right. There's a lot of hesitancy on the part of the agency to create controversy, and so they want to avoid controversy, and that sometimes subsumes their mission.
But I thought the Biden administration was all about protecting biodiversity. I mean, 30 by 30. We're going to protect 30% of America's lands and waters for nature by 2030. Didn't Fish and Wildlife get the memo?
Well, it's a laudable goal. It's just not much specifics there and how we're going to get there.
And here we are 3 years into the administration. Against this loss of species, we're also discovering new species. That's Great Smoky Mountains National Park alone. Nearly 1,100 previously unknown species have been discovered over the past 25 years since Discover Life in America began inventorying species at Great Smoky Mountains National Park. It's just been an incredible endeavor that they've done, and the species that they're finding, the known species that weren't thought to exist in the park that they're finding there is, I think, over 10,000 species. Do we need to expand such efforts to search for new species and to come up with a good baseline for what we know is out there, whether it's new or whether it's a species we know about but didn't think it was over there?
Yeah, I certainly wouldn't say no to that. Being a scientist and a mapper, the more data that we have, the better. I'll always encourage efforts like that, especially citizen science efforts as well, to help us understand what species are out there and where. It really can help at the end of the day for very strategic, targeted efforts for conservation. Sorry, I lost my train of thought there.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think, one of the problems is we don't even know what we're losing. The UN and scientists from around the world have warned that we're at risk of losing more than 1 million species in the coming decades. And most of those species are probably species that have never even been described. I mean, just the fact that we're still describing species in the US, a highly settled country, that's put a fair amount of money into research, and, really highlights that we're just beginning to understand our world and to understand its diversity.
Among the species that recently were declared extinct, I believe, were 8 species of Hawaiian honey creepers, small birds that live in the forests out there in Haleakala National Park, and I'm sure in Hawaii Volcanoes National Park, some of them. And yet, while we've lost those species, I mean, the Biden administration is trying its hardest to reverse some of those trends. No, with the recent efforts by Interior and by the state of Hawaii to basically deconstruct, if you will, mosquitoes that carry avian malaria up into the forest, and which the birds are really exposed to and usually end up dying when they get infected with it.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully it's not, again, too little too late. One of the species, Akikiki, is down to 5 individuals in the wild. We're literally watching these birds go extinct right before our eyes. The mosquitoes and the diseases were introduced a long time ago, and up through the 70s, there was the belief that Haleakala and Hawaii volcanoes, as well as the Alakai Swamp on Kauai, that those places would provide a long-term refuge because they were too high and cold for mosquitoes. And with climate change, that's turning out not to be true. And so, particularly on Kauai, which is the lowest of those 3 that I just mentioned, it's happened really rapidly. The mosquitoes have moved uphill so that they're covering the whole island, and that's why the Akikiki and the Akeakee also are just in steep decline and going extinct, despite massive efforts to try and save them. So I really hope the effort to address mosquitoes with this novel use of something called Wolbachia. It's a bacteria that's found in all mosquitoes, and they introduce mosquitoes with a different form of Wolbachia that makes their offspring infertile. There's been some people who, they just see it as us messing with nature. They don't understand that mosquitoes aren't native there. They don't understand that Wolbachia and the mosquitoes are both already there. I've tried to challenge it in court, and we've been interveners to defend the state's effort to do that.
Any idea how long it might be before we see any signals that this effort is moving in the right direction, that is successful?
I haven't heard that, but because they just started doing it, they just started doing it in Maui within the last few months, and then they now are starting to do it in Kauai too.
Yeah, I'm just wondering. I mean, trying to keep track of mosquitoes is not an easy task, and as you mentioned, with climate change, they're going higher and higher. And of course, the recent fires in Maui. I believe there were some wildlife sanctuaries where people were trying to protect some honey creepers, if I remember my newscasts.
Yeah, they had some captive akikiki. They've been bringing birds out of the wild to try and captive breed them, and they had some of the birds on Maui in an aviary, and apparently people who from the aviary ended up being out fighting fire at the aviary, and then they were able to move the birds. Fortunately, the birds weren't lost.
Yeah, I was wondering the outcome of that. This is Kurt Repenchek with National Parks Traveler. We're talking Extinction and the Endangered Species Act with Lindsay Rosa, Vice President of Conservation Research and Innovation at Defenders of Wildlife, and Noah Greenwald, the Endangered Species Director at the Center for Biological Diversity. We're going to take a short break and we'll be right back.
The Grand Teton National Park Foundation is a private, nonprofit organization that supports projects that protect and enhance Grand Teton National Park's cultural, historic, and natural resources. By funding initiatives that go beyond what the National Park Service could accomplish on its own, Foundation donors improve the visitor experience and provide benefits to the national park system for decades to come. You can see their successes at gtnpf.org. Full of stunning photography and thought-provoking reads, Smoky's Life is a biannual magazine produced by Great Smoky Mountains Association. Members receive it free of charge each spring and fall, and it is available for purchase in retail stores throughout Great Smoky Mountains National Park and online at smokiesinformation.org. The Blue Ridge Parkway Foundation is the primary nonprofit fundraising partner for the Blue Ridge Parkway. It is made up of people who have a deep love for this majestic road and want to ensure that its natural beauty and the experiences it offers endure for generations to come. Show your appreciation at vrpfoundation.org.
So I'm wondering, looking at this recent list of species that have gone extinct, there's no charismatic megafauna, which I guess that might be a good thing, or it might also be because we've already did a pretty bad job with preserving charismatic megafauna. Of course, there's always the ongoing debates about whether the gray wolf or the grizzly bear should be delisted, and we've got the on-again, off-again efforts to restore grizzly bears in the North Cascades ecosystem. How would you guys describe the plight of the larger mammals that people can make a readier connection with, as opposed to some of the freshwater mussel species or even the warblers?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've talked a little bit already about, politics. That certainly has played a role here, and a lot of those species, even those that are maybe not the fuzzies with the sharp teeth, but some of those that are still certainly very visible, like the kind of the lesser prairie chicken, and in some of those, similar parts of the world where there's this kind of struggle between, or confusion between conservation and livelihoods. We're seeing a lot of interesting new ways to kind of bring attacks to endangered species and the protections that are afforded by the Act in Congress. I'm sure that's something that that Noah can speak to, as well as as part of this effort for the 50th anniversary of the Endangered Species Act. We've noticed quite a rise in some of those political attacks, and a lot of them are surrounding these megafauna, like you say. Grizzly bear is certainly on that list. Gray wolf is on that list, and unfortunately, the kind of attacks continue. I think we're near 50 attacks on the Endangered Species Act now during its 50th anniversary. So, yeah, but we can continue to push that these species too are similarly in need of these protections in many cases.
Well, I'm curious, Lindsay, you mentioned, the 50th anniversary of the Endangered Species Act, and Defenders recently conducted a poll that showed the vast majority of Americans, regardless of political party, support the Endangered Species Act. And yet, as you mentioned, Congress is on track to be one of the worst on record for its treatment of the ESA. There's a disconnect here someplace, right?
Absolutely, yes. A very strong disconnect, I think, between those who have who members of Congress and some of their constituents. So, I think Americans say it well. They support the Endangered Species Act. They understand that biodiversity is important to their everyday lives, right? So whether it's the gray wolf or the grizzly bear or the lesser prairie chicken or those freshwater mussels, right? All of those species contribute. And our poll numbers show that people get that and they understand. But yeah, unfortunately, the folks who are that are representing those people right now are taking action that doesn't really fit that sentiment.
Yeah, I think we've seen a really organized and well-funded anti-regulatory campaign in our country with just millions of dollars behind it, funded by the likes of Charles Koch, that have put people in Congress, put a lot of money behind people getting into Congress that have an anti-regulatory agenda. And so they've done a lot to undermine our bedrock environmental laws, and they've been able to pack the Supreme Court at this point. And so, really this minority viewpoint with so much money behind it has been able to get quite a bit further than you would think it should. And a lot of that, I don't know, this is all politics, and it's unfortunate to have to talk about it, but a lot of that has been misleading to people who they get votes from. They trumpet it as they're going to take your guns away, but really it's a corporate driven, polluter driven campaign to undo regulations and protections for wildlife and clean water and clean air, climate.
Yeah, talking about the Endangered Species Act, there's been an effort, I think it's still ongoing, still in the courts, to seek endangered species protection for bison in Yellowstone National Park. I wonder if you're familiar with that and any thoughts on it.
Well, I've always been confused as to why bison aren't listed overall. They're in something like 1% of their range, even less than that of their abundance. And so I've always thought that, trying to list them in Yellowstone is, I get the sentiment. It's terrible that they get killed when they move out of the park, but it is the spot where it's their last stronghold. It's the spot where they're doing the best. So it's kind of a hard way to make the case. It's always struck me that they should be listed everywhere. Fish and Wildlife Service did do a status review of them. I don't know, maybe it was 10 years ago. And one thing that was good that they did in there was that they separated out commercial herds from conservation herds, because most of the bison that we have in the country are actually beefalo. There's something like 200,000 or 300,000 beefalo. They're hybrids with cattle. And in terms of, actual bison that represent the species, it's really just, like a few dozen herds with, maybe 20,000 animals at best. There's been some great progress by tribes in recent years, but other than that, this is a highly diminished animal. I actually had coffee with Gary Fraser, who runs ecological services at Fish and Wildlife Service. And I asked him, because it baffles me, it's literally like mammal of America, it's like, it's a symbol of our country. And so why Fish and Wildlife Service wouldn't want to be involved in its recovery and list it as threatened, which it certainly is, has always baffled me. And his response was basically just, do you really think it's at risk? And it was like, well, yeah, and also, it's the idea is to conserve the ecosystems upon which species depend. And if there's an ecosystem that needs conserving, it's the prairies of the Great Plains.
Yeah, I wonder though, I think it's been demonstrated that there are no bison left that are pure bison genetically. I believe they've found that all bison, to a varying degree, have cattle genes in them. So have we already lost that battle?
I don't think so. I mean, I hear what you're saying, but there definitely are populations, again, these conservation herds and the bison in Yellowstone, that really represent the species. They have a very small percent of cattle genes. It's a much different thing when you're talking about commercial bison and, that have substantial integration with cattle.
I mean, to Noah's point, I think it is, a little bit interesting that, right, it is the icon of the Department of Interior. And I know that there is a lot of great work being done by the tribes, some of the tribes out there, to kind of transfer herds to kind of get at some of these genetic issues that you're talking about. But yeah, certainly, I mean, an ecologically important and culturally important species that we need to make sure stays around.
Yeah, I guess the thing with bison is people, see that there's 500,000 bison in North America, so how can that possibly be endangered? But, to your point, Noah, bison once roamed from Nevada to Virginia, from Canada down to the Rio Grande. And so when you look at it that way, yeah, there's a big void out there across the landscape. Let me ask you, as we wrap up, what species are you most concerned about today?
That's a tough one. I don't know that I can pick one. I mean, right, this is part of the problem, is they're all so interconnected, and we talk about species and of course the loss of 21 here, but it's not just the species, right, that we're losing. It's the evolutionary history, it's the niches that they serve, the functions, the interactions between them and other species. And those things aren't just being lost when a species goes extinct, right? That's the whole concern with biodiversity loss. Extinction is just one part of that. It's a very permanent part of that. But, we're losing these things all the time as populations are declining, as, we're down to 5 individuals of a species in Hawaii. It's struggling. And this, I mean, this is the wake-up call, right? I mean, we talked about the 8 freshwater mussels and some fishes that were lost. There's the only thing more canary in the coal mine is a canary in the coal mine, right? This is, we're talking about degradation of rivers and aquatics in some of the most biodiverse parts of of the contiguous US, right? The Southeast rivers. So yeah, I don't think I can pick just one. I think that this is something that resonates because, that's biodiversity. You lose one species and you start to see the sweater unravel as you pull the threads. So there's not just one that I'm concerned about. I stay awake at night thinking more about what that means when what happens when just one is lost. It's more than that.
Well, I definitely would point to Akikiki. And as part of that, I would point to just, what that says there is that our problems are starting to come together, essentially, the problems we cause. We've spread species all over the planet. We've destroyed and fragmented habitats. We're changing the climate. And those impacts are starting to interact in ways that are surprising and unpredictable. And, mosquitoes moving uphill is one example of that. The fire that burned Lahaina was driven by invasive grasses, so, climate change, invasive species, habitat destruction, if we do not change our course in a really substantial way now, it's really going to run away from us. And so it's scary and it's hard to watch the world right now. We see wars, when we need to get together and work on these problems, and work together because they're difficult issues.
Yeah. Any insights on the California condor? I mean, it's been hit somewhat hard this year by avian malaria, and there was just a story out of Redwood National and State Parks in California about a condor ingesting lead shot from a carcass, and wildlife biologists trying to save it. I mean, there's not a lot of California condors out there either.
Yeah, for sure. It's a really concerning species that needs constant management. And, actually, it sort of brings us back to what I was talking about earlier about this well-funded campaign, anti-regulatory campaign, because if there's one thing that I just really scratch my head over is why we're still using lead ammunition. It's been known to be toxic since Roman times, essentially, and it has serious human health risks associated with it, with hunting with it. And, there's great alternatives. And so it's just mind-boggling that this issue is not solved. And, Congress has actually taken action in the last 20 years to prevent the EPA from regulating lead ammunition. And it's just nonsensical.
Yeah.
I think the condor is a perfect example too. I mean, you talk about malaria, you talk about lead, a lot of the things that we, hear about or are being pushed, certainly at the kind of national scale, is climate change, habitat loss. And these are big issues. These are impacting a great number of species listed or unlisted under the Act. But, looking into the data as we've done and thinking about all these other threats, right? If you just continue to kind of think about and focus on addressing those two, there's, over 3/4 of our listed species would still have threats that go unaddressed because, all of these other ones that you talk about. So we always talk about, right, the habitat loss and the climate change, and it's very important. And there's all these synergies among these threats that we also need to start to understand better and tease apart through our kind of research and collaborative scientific knowledge. But there's also these other ones. So we really kind of need this kind of comprehensive understanding and these efforts to really stem what's going on with biodiversity loss here in the US and globally.
Yeah. And we don't have time to get into it, but, talking about invasive species, you just look at Everglades National Park and the Burmese python, and there's some other reptilian species that are creeping into there, no pun intended, that are having a great impact on the native species there in Everglades. Be an interesting story somebody should do about looking at national parks and endangered and threatened species and which way they're going. That was Lindsay Rosa from the Defenders of Wildlife and Noah Greenwald for Center for Biological Diversity. Folks, thanks so much for joining me today and talking about this critical issue when we're looking out across nature in the United States and even broader across the world, and the state of nature and what we're losing and what we're trying to save. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you, Kurt.
Thank you.
That's our show for this week. We hope you enjoyed it. To learn more about threatened and endangered species in the Endangered Species Act, you can visit the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Center for Biological Diversity, and Defenders of Wildlife websites. On its website, the Interior Department celebrates the 50th anniversary of the Endangered Species Act with a number of success stories. For The Traveler, this is Kurt Repenchek. See you in the parks.
The composers and musicians at Orange Tree Productions have created a unique collection known as the National Park Series that has grown to include more than 30 CD titles. Composed against the backdrop of a park's sounds of nature, these musical scores will connect you with these beautiful places and take you there, at least in your mind. This collection is the #1 selling National Park audio series in the world and provides the background music for National Parks Travelers podcasts. Visit them at orangetreeproductions.com. Editing and production work for the National Parks Traveler podcast is done by Splitbeard Productions. You can learn more about us at splitbeardproductions.com. National Parks Traveler is a 501c3 nonprofit media organization that provides daily editorial coverage of national parks and protected areas. Traveler's coverage is made possible by reader and listener donations. Visit us at nationalparkstraveler.org.